And so within our the training, for example, for psychology, you would expect people who have become resilient in spite of maybe many of the lived experience of mental health. It's a bit different to, I guess, in the tech industry, where mental health, the lived experience of mental health may not be a desirable, characteristic of a person, whereas in mental health it does help in terms of empathic understanding of the other person's issue.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited about today. It's a special Smithfield Smackdown edition. We're going to focus on mental health in leadership today. I've got a really special guest with me, Chantal, who's a psychologist. And I really want to talk a little bit about the expectations for managers and leaders to kind of be built-in resilience and be really tough, and hopefully offer our audience some takeaways and advice on mental health and stress management from a real expert. So over to you, Chantal. If you can introduce yourself and tell us some of the places that you've worked and types of roles that you've done.
Thank you, and thank you for that lovely introduction as well. So I'm Dr. Chantal Skyer, and I've worked across a series of different organizations. Interestingly, I worked within prisons. I worked in the forensic setting, which was very, very interesting as well. And, really, there's a lot of advice that I can be thinking of in terms of leadership. And then currently I'm working in an NHS, in a North London Mental Health Trust. So I think the subject of resilience will be something that certainly would be interesting to catch up on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Chantal, I just wanted to say for context that, obviously you don't work specifically in tech, but it's part of everybody's world. But
Yes.
specifically in tech, today we're talking about leadership really in general, rather than specifically for tech. But we think that your experience and your great, kind of in the workplace experience will be able to provide our leadership audience with some pointers on how they can look after themselves and look after others and stuff like that. So thank you for introducing yourself and telling us some of the wonderful places that you've worked. I just thought for context, it would be useful to share that with the audience, that you're not tech specific. But can we start with sort of looking after yourself? Because, I sort of touched on that in the intro as well, that many people just feel, particularly in leadership roles, I think you feel like there's an expectation to always be resilient, even at a personal cost sometimes. What are the risks of that, and how can people manage their own mental health?
Yeah, and I think resilience has become a bit of a buzzword for meaning a variety of things. When we think about resilient teams, for example, you might have some people who feel it's a matter of putting up with things and therefore piling on more and more of the stress. Um, I like the thinking of resilience about the ability to bounce back quickly from things which have been quite stressful. And resilience certainly doesn't mean being able to manage more and more stresses without having to be able to take a pause and be able to step back from all the stress. In terms of how teams and leaders lead resilient teams, it's about having a really good system of reflection within the team, but also enabling teams and leaders to be able to take a step back and measure the temperature of a team. So resilience means that, resilient means when you are faced with some upset or distress, it's the ability to be able to absorb the distress and then reflect on it and make sense of it by giving it a different reframe, for example. So we know that stress is always associated with lack of control, and people will feel stress when they feel they cannot control their environment, and they have lack of control over it. So what resilience does is allow us, and especially as leaders, to understand that and to be able to manage the stress in a way that is more reflective rather than reactive. And I think
Yeah.
that's important.
That makes sense. And that's good that you've kind of laid that out for us, actually, because I think you're right. Resilience is a word that's been bandied about loads, and it's useful to think about that in the context of feeling out of control, and that's when you get stressed. I heard something. I was talking about resilience about a year ago, and somebody
Mm-hmm.
was talking about, there's that expectation of it kind of just being your personality, you being resilient, but actually resilience can. The analogy they gave, which I thought was beautiful, actually, was about a plant. If a plant is well watered and it has lots of sunshine, then its ability to be resilient is better than one that has been neglected and perhaps doesn't have the stuff around it that it
Mm,
needs to
yeah.
grow. What's your perspective on that as sort of resilience, that you do need to have things that help
Yeah, well,
you?
from a psychological perspective, we know that individuals or people who've faced a lot of quite traumatic situations in the past have less ability to bounce back. And so
Of
there is
course.
something about internalizing a blueprint for yourself, which means that you can get over this. You can use your network, you can use your internal coping skills to be able to get over a particularly tricky bump in the road. Now, individuals who have, and this is the research and the evidence base shows that individuals who have been consistently faced with quite traumatic events in their lives, and especially at a younger age, will be less able to be able to cope with other distress. And that is because you almost, if you think of a bucket analogy, you almost run out of space and emotional space to be able to deal with more and more and more
Mhm.
stress. Your baseline for dealing with stress becomes too stretched, and you're
Yeah.
always in threat mode. Uh,
A- And so bringing that into the workplace a bit more,
mhm,
um, because, you can't really separate your life and your work, and I appreciate that.
yeah.
But in the workplace, what are the kind of actions, like their daily or weekly actions, that can make a really big difference for leaders to manage that stress or burnout as well, when you've been stressed for a long time?
Yeah. And so I think, well, within my sector, we have a lot of anchor points where, as leaders, you would meet with a team, and we call that, reflective spaces or supervision.
Hmm.
And these can be done in a group, and it's a safe space. It's a psychologically safe space where teams can get back to and think about issues in a way that is not going to be judged, in a way that it's going to be
Mm,
psychologically safe. And these areas can be discussed. So it can be a dynamic within the team between two workers where
yeah.
people sit down and have the curiosity, and you set some boundaries where people can be curious about somebody else's behavior, or they can also question without the other person feeling critiqued. So it's important to have these spaces, and it can be water cooler moments, for example, where everybody in the team, doesn't have to be just the lead, is emboldened and is also empowered to be able to be a bit of a to be somebody who's a sounding board for somebody who might be struggling. And so, what we do within our teams is we empower everybody to have that ability to ask a colleague, for example, if they see them being a bit quiet, or they see
Hmm.
them not being their usual self, to empower them to go to them and say, is everything okay? And without the need to create, a big sort of crisis point for the person, but it is important for the culture in a team and the culture in any setting to be created so that people feel psychologically safe, but also for leads to model that behavior, and for leaders to be able to model vulnerability and be able to model um, being able to take on, criticism without having to defend their view. So I think modeling from leaders is really important. Creating a culture where curiosity and compassion is one that drives outcomes rather than, targets and not meeting your objectives.
Yeah.
I don't know if that does that sort of make sense.
Yes, that does make sense. I think that's really good and interesting information about teams. And I think, I wanted to talk a bit about, kind of leadership and your responsibility for also looking after others. So perhaps we could spend a bit of time talking about, I mean, you talked about creating sort of safe spaces and structures. And I think things like that are really important because they're sort of beyond the surface level gestures that we often see coming from leadership. So, how does a leader genuinely foster a culture where people can feel safe, particularly to talk about, outside work stress or in work stress and those mental health challenges?
Yeah. So as I said, so if it is the culture of a team to be able to question or to be able to challenge without the fear of being remonstrated against, that's important. So culture is key, and the way
Yeah.
that you instill a culture is by doing little things, like, for example, having early morning meetings, bring tea and coffee, and nurture the team in a physical way, and it's symbolic for how the team can operate. Enable people to be, if they need to, for example, have a break or take time out because of caring duties. You
Mm,
show that yes,
yeah.
you are willing to be able to be flexible. Encourage people to talk about what is going on for them in a way that is going to be helpful for them, maybe in supervision, or you
Mm,
catch up with people.
yeah.
But it's those little things that shows people that this is an area, this is a sector, this is an organization that cares about me beyond just me being at my desk and
Yeah.
producing targets. So little things like, bringing in, as I said, tea, coffee, some breaks, you have some social events. So all of those things are physical demonstrations and actual demonstrations of what is going on at the leadership level and for the culture of the team.
Mm. The perception for me is that, the a kind of corporate world has got much, much better at that since COVID, understanding that people have parental or caring responsibilities, or just generally that they have stuff going on outside
Hmm.
work.
Yeah.
And that feels like it's a bit more recognized now. Is that, does that mirror what you're seeing?
I think so, but it needs to come from an authentic base as well, and it can't just be a tick box
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah.
So I think authenticity is really key as well, and people
Mm,
intuitively know whether somebody is authentically caring about them in terms of
mm,
compassion, or it's just because it looks good on paper and it's part of our HR policies.
yeah.
And again, I'll go back to, and I always go back to culture. And I think thinking about how leaders then can look after themselves, because leaders, surprise, surprise, are human beings as well. And to take on a lot of the responsibility that it can also create a lot of stress within leaders because they might feel that they are not uh, being good enough leaders. So one of the ways that is important is being accountable to oneself. So it's not only holding teams to account, but being accountable to oneself, using the
Mm,
powers and the tools of self-reflection, utilizing tools like the 360 interviews with your team, but also connecting with your network. So what we do within the NHS, we have a very strong culture of connecting with each other as leads, and we form like a buddy group. And it's not like a formal supervision, but it's a space where we,
yeah.
at the same level, we can all meet together, we talk to each other, we talk about, we have a community of practice within our leadership group. And I think that's really, really
Mm,
helpful
yeah.
um, because it allows you to talk about your difficulties, if you will.
Mm. So you have a sort of peer group where that again that
Yeah.
word of safe space keeps coming up, right? Where people are able to share what's going on for them and in a really safe environment.
It's key. It's key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When when you're building teams, or certainly when you're hiring and recruiting people or onboarding them,
Yes.
how do you look to build resilient teams? Because, it kind of goes back to what we were saying is that if you're well watered and you've got lots of sunshine, you're going to be in a more resilient place. How do you build that?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think herein lies perhaps the difference between my sector and, the tech industry, because we actually actively look for people with lived experience of mental health. And so within our the training, for example, for psychology, you would expect people who have become resilient in spite of maybe many of the lived
Mm.
experience of mental health. So it's a bit different to, I guess, in the tech industry where mental health, lived experience of mental health may not be
Yes.
a desirable,
Mm.
um, characteristic of a person, whereas in mental health, it does help in terms of empathic understanding of the other
Mm.
person's issue.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's completely at odds with probably what we see. We want people to show up with, you know, looking and
yeah.
sounding like they are resilient and they can deal with challenging situations from the outset. So,
From the outset, yes, but within mental health as well, there is something about bringing your authentic self to the table. So if you have got lived experience, you are able to perhaps walk in the shoes of the other person who
mm,
might be
yes.
experiencing that. And the fact that you've gone through all of your training, the fact that you've gone through about 10 years of to become a psychologist means that you are by default quite resilient in that area.
Mm,
But being resilient doesn't mean not, being, not having any mental health issues. That doesn't mean that. It
yeah.
just means the ability to bounce back from difficulties
Mm,
rather than negation of any
yes.
issues.
Whereas I guess, we're not really talking about people's personal life situations. When we're talking about resilience, we might be talking about a tricky client or, a tricky team member, um,
Yeah,
or, a project that's not on track. So they're quite
I,
different situations, aren't they?
they are
When we're talking
different.
about
Yeah,
resilience, and
they are.
we're definitely looking for people to have experience of those because then they know how to deal with them, what to expect, how to, kind of get to the other side efficiently, effectively without affecting the resilience of the team too much.
I understand that, but there is something about we bring, when we are problem solving, when we are thinking about how to resolve problems, we have to look into ourselves. We can't just separate ourselves into a work mode and then a
Mm,
personal mode. So
yeah,
what happens is all of your past experiences about how you've resolved problems or how you manage stress comes to the fore. And so whilst you may not um, utilize personal, you're not going to talk about your personal story. You are using all your data from the past in
of
terms of how
course.
you manage stress
Yes.
into the situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think the reality of the kind of corporate tech world, perhaps that I work in, is that, there are some businesses that have much more of a lens on culture and how people work together and making sure there's that empathy in the room and that people bring their authentic self. But the reality is there are some businesses who want you to show up, deliver, and,
Yeah.
not
So yeah.
bring that much of yourself to work, actually.
So it'd be interesting to know what the burnout rate is then amongst those industries. And the
Yeah.
burnout rate, I'm not saying the NHS is not. There's a lot of burnout, and that is
Mm.
perhaps amongst other professions. So I know that, for example, with medics or nurses on the ground, where the model, and this is not to offend my
Mm.
non-psychology colleagues, but it's very, very hard because you are in very, very emotive, high volatile environments where you have to be really quite you have to react all the time, so you're always, and I spoke before quickly about threat mode. Your brain is then always looking out for the danger, always looking out for the criticism, and if you had to translate that to the corporate world, it could be the same. You're always
Mm.
expected to
Yeah.
perform to a certain standard. And if you don't, there's a danger lurking around the corner. If you're not able then to manage that danger in a psychologically safe space with your colleagues, it just builds up and builds up and builds up. So,
Yeah.
and, and,
Well,
and this is, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been a really interesting podcast and very different from ones that I've done previously, which are focusing much more on sort of leadership issues in tech, but a very important one nonetheless. So I really appreciate you sharing your time with me today, Chantal. But in the spirit of World Mental Health Day, it'd be
Yeah.
really useful to hear your thoughts on, you know, kind of a really practical thing that a leader can do to improve their own mental health, but also work with their team's mental health. Like, what would be your one hot tip?
Yeah. I think if the old adage of know thyself, so if leaders have a really, really good self-awareness and they know
Mm.
what their trigger points are, they understand, they're embodied in the way that they understand when they are stressed. They notice what it's like to be on the other side of them. This is a question I always ask myself. What is it like to be on the other side of me when I'm giving out challenges, or if
Mm-hmm.
I'm, thinking about a performance issue? What is it like to be on the other side of me? And I think that's a really good way
That's
of
a really
checking
good
in on
tip.
myself. Yeah,
That's a really, really good tip. And I think that one actually serves everybody, doesn't it? Like if people in leadership roles, but also people who are working with those leadership teams trying to get things delivered. Like, what is it like to work with me when I am stressed, when I'm tired, when I'm on
yeah,
a deadline, when I'm, you know, short? Am I short or am I snappy? You know, what are
definitely.
my behaviors that I display?
And that is
And
self-awareness, and
yes,
that's our role. We need to do without self-awareness, we are leading much more on what we perceive is um, the correct situation without really being empathic to the other person and in tune to what the other person's needs are. And I think self-awareness is key to good leadership. It's number one.
awesome. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Chantal, for sharing
Yeah,
your
I've really
time, very
enjoyed
important
this.
time with us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, B.